You guys are in for a treat this evening. Our first Thursday seminar, Dr. Ray Ashley is a friend near and dear to National Maritime Historical Society. Dr. Ashley was the CEO and president of the Maritime Museum of San Diego for 30 years. He just recently retired. He's also an alum of East Carolina University, like many of us, and also holds a PhD in history from Duke University. He's contributed to so many professional and historical publications, including Mainsail Hall, which the Maritime Museum of San Diego has published for many years, and many issues of Sea History magazine as well. He's a licensed master mariner with thousands of miles of experience at sea in a variety of vessels, including leading the building and operation of the 16th century Spanish galleon that they built there at the Maritime Museum of San Diego, which I'm sure will come up in the presentation here somewhere along the way. He is also on our Ships Council here at NMHS and on the Historic Ships Committee of U.S. ICOMOS. So he's a valuable voice in ship preservation. We are so glad he's here with us this evening. As Heather said, the best way for you to show your support for these kinds of programs is to become a member of NMHS. So we're going to put information on how to do that as well as how to donate over in the chat. That's also where you're going to put any comments along the way, and I'll be moderating those and leading a conversation with Ray at the end. So please feel free to do that anywhere along the way. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Ray Ashley. Ray, thank you for joining us this evening.
Hey, well, thank you. So before I even start, I just want to extend that thank you to all my friends at NMHS, including Susan and Dee and Heather and Kathy Yu. And thank you so much for inviting me. And I want to just thank everybody that's attending this. I can't see all of you, but I think there's probably a goodly number of my friends that are listening in. So thank you so much for joining in. And thank you for not being, after all this time, those of you who are tired of my voice by now. So in any case, so we're going to talk about something that almost all of us, I think, that have been to California have experienced, the El Camino Real. And the question is, well, was it for real? Because I never doubted it through most of my life. And what I was used to seeing is, hang on just a second now, if we can advance this. There you go. As you drive along the highway of California, particularly US 1, or really only US 1 and US 101, this is what you see, these bells. There were more of them years ago. For a while, there weren't many because people were stealing them, but now there's more back again. So what they do is they evoke something that is supposed to remind us of an earlier time, of a romantic period in California's history when it was, remote from the rest of the world and consisted of ranchos and presidios and missions that were connected along this route that linked them all into one thing, one common thing called El Camino Real. And today, there's an effort afoot to have all of those missions and the El Camino Real inscripted by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site, a multinational World Heritage Site, connected with a similar chain of missions in Baja California. So that notion of a connective link to all of them that bring them all together into one construct as a pathway of migration and trade and communication is pretty essential to the notion that what we're dealing with is an element of world heritage. So the nature of that link is pretty important, and the story of it's pretty important. So I'm going to make just a few brief disclaimers. One is that this isn't really going to be chronological, so that could be confusing, but if I warn you ahead of time, that helps. It's a sea story after all, and sea stories sometimes are not chronological, as those of you who watched the recent movie The Odyssey know by now. Also, it's cyclic in nature as opposed to lineal in a way, because the El Camino Real, I'm going to argue, really was kind of a cyclic thing. The second one, the second one is going to be, this is supposed to be a sea story, and it is. This is, after all, the National Maritime Historical Society. But for a long time, that sea story has lived underneath an illusion. And to be able to get to it, we're going to have to actually deconstruct that illusion and penetrate it to get to the sea story, which is, in my I think the most fun part of it all. It has been for me. And then finally, I use a lot of maps in this. And whenever I do something that has a lot of maps in it, I'm obliged to tell you that all maps are lies. Whether it's a nautical chart, or it's your chart plotter, or it's the maps you're going to see here. Good to know. Maps seem to speak with an authority that they presume, but all of them, one way or another, are lies. So with that, let's continue. I was taught in fourth grade that this road, linked, I don't know why, linked these things, these missions. There were 21 of them. And I was taught in fourth grade, well, they were situated deliberately to be one day's travel apart, going from San Diego all the way up past San Francisco. And it also connected the ranchos and the Presidios. And you could travel that now, and you could follow this route on 101 by these bells, because that marked the old highway that connected all of them, the El Camino Real. And so I never questioned that story. And I think most people haven't, and millions of people have traveled up and down those roads, imagining that they were recreating in a compressed way an experience of some far gone world that has now disappeared, leaving only these as the remnants of it. The story is actually a little bit different than that. It evokes a romantic past for some of us. Not all of us think it is. The indigenous peoples of California, for instance, think that those bells are actually something else. They kind of remind them of a tragic period in their history. But be that as it may, the Spanish didn't put those up. And there doesn't seem as though there was anything for them to have put them up on, even if they had bells to put up. Um, but what they seem to mark, the other thing about it is when someone puts things like this up, it suggests that they're marking a moment in time when important things first started to happen. And that's kind of a presentist point of view that we naturally fall into without thinking about it much. But it is rather arrogant. And in fact, what I'd like you to consider is that this is an illusion. It only captures at best an erroneous piece, but only a small piece of the much bigger thing that really is the El Camino Real. That it was far older than we think. It was far wetter than we think, and it is different than we think. So penetrating that illusion is what we are going to try and do. Um, it evokes, like I said, for many of us, a romantic period in California. And there have been attempts to portray that for a long time. One of the most successful was Helen Hunt Jackson's novel Ramona, that was written in 1884. And this was a romantic period piece written about a period of time earlier than this, in the immediate aftermath of the American War with Mexico. And the people in that novel were nostalgic themselves about the earlier period before that, before the Americans came and invaded the West. So there was like a double dip of nostalgia that simply amplified the romance. And it was a world kind of like you see depicted in this book cover, where there were missions and ranchos and things connected, and people traveled up and down it pretty readily. And it was a world that was kind of connected with itself and cohesive in that way. Um, well, by the time Helen Hunt Jackson was writing that story, the architectural features that were iconic to that story were all crumbling away. They looked like this. And that, at the time, lent another aura of romance, a kind of a patina of romance with, that ruins do. But if things had not changed, there would probably be none of those missions left, or none of those structures left, because they weren't very built of very durable materials, as it turns out. And they had been abandoned for a long time, again, contributing to the notion that it was a romantic past. Well, then something happened that no one would have expected, at least in Helen Hunt Jackson's day, and that was the advent of the automobile. Well, automobiles need roads. And as it turns out, roads developed pretty quickly that ended up connecting these various places, because it turns out the missions were in places where it was natural to have cities, namely seaports and anchorages and places ships could go. These roads gave the possibility, actually for the first time, of rapidly traveling this route that goes from south to north or north to south, bringing all these missions into some sort of contact with each other in a way that they had never been before. And at this point, earlier on, the automobile, even though it had appeared, had yet to make its presence fully felt. The notion of what it could become was promoted by a lot of people, the auto manufacturers, the oil companies, but also by the Southern Auto Club of California. They wanted to promote the idea that cars weren't just a conveyance to get from one place to another or haul stuff. they actually could provide a kind of experience no one had ever had before. That you could travel not only through a geography or space, you could actually, by going to historic sites, in a way, travel through time. And because you could do it more quickly than you ever could on a horse or walking, it would kind of compress that experience and amplify it in a way so that you could actually, in a way, kind of have a dose of what it would have been like to be in the past. So there were conveyances that had multi dimensions to them, but they were yet to make themselves felt. Even so, early on, the Southern Auto Club and the auto companies, I think, promoted the idea of the car as something that you could seek experiences with romance and adventure. It wasn't clear where you were going to go and what you were going to do, but at least they made early efforts to get people from the rest of the country to come to California. Now, the guy who was the um, president of Southern Auto Club, Dr. Milbank Johnson, was a physiologist who taught at USC, and he really wanted to promote the concept of the car able to do all of those things. And in that effort, he had an ally with a fairly well-to-do woman named Harriet Forbes, who was a socialite in Los Angeles. She was prominent not only in the social world of California, but she was also a historic preservationist and was an advocate of the progressive era values of city beautiful movements and things like that. She was also a believer in historic preservation. She was president of the California Historical Society and president of the Daughters of the Golden West. And she felt that the ruins of the missions once lost were something that we would lose forever and needed to be recovered. So whereas Johnson wanted to have automobiles connect things and take people places that before they couldn't go, she was going to give him the place to go. And the roads, of course, that those cars needed would connect all of those places. And as it turns out, to evoke that romantic past, missions were the ideal places to do that. But they needed something to brand that whole experience. And she suggested to Dr. Johnson, what about if we just put bells up everywhere? We'd have these bells and they'd be strung from these kind of crooked shafts that look like a biblical shepherd's staff. And you can imagine Father Sarah trudging up and down, the roads between the missions, using this as a walking stick. He thought that was a grand idea. I said, how many of these bells do you think it would take? She said, well, between 400 and 500. And he thought, well, where are we going to get 400 or 500 of these bronze bells? And she replied, well, my family has a foundry and we'd be happy to make them and sell them to the state of California for a really good price. So off they went. And her foundry started casting those bells, and they started putting them up all along this road that they had to identify, which ultimately became US 1 and US 101. Now, the first one of those bells went in place in Los Angeles in 1906 at the Plaza Church. Now, the Plaza Church was never a mission. However, it was only 2 blocks away from the Southern Auto Club, so there was a really good connection there. And from there, it expanded out to all of those missions. So the Auto Club, to promote that, began to present the notion of something called the El Camino Real, this grand royal highway linking all these places. And it had pioneered the use of these kinds of maps, strip maps, that kept you on the straight and narrow, where you were supposed to go. And you were supposed to stay on the El Camino Real and experience this romantic sense of California. And this is a 1915 map for that period. Now, in 1906, when this whole scheme started, there were only about 20,000 automobiles in the United States. But 2 years later, the Model T came out. Using assembly line methods, it was possible now to build an automobile in 1/12 the time as was formerly the case. So within less than a decade, there were 200,000 automobiles in the United States, and more all the time, in increasing numbers. And so this notion of cars becoming an element of society and civilization that they thought was really, they just thought about or something in the future, was rapidly happening. And to promote that further, of course, they used maps. Now, as I said, maps have an authority on their own. So when someone lays this out, it's a way of branding the notion of an El Camino Real. So for instance, in this map to the left, all 21 missions, it says in geographical order, but then in parentheses, but not in chronological order, because they want to let you know they don't want to mislead you to that degree, because they don't want to try and convince you of something that wasn't there. Or the other one to the right that says, and now it's possible to experience the romance of early California and the comfort of your own automobile. In other words, all the adventure, all the romance, none of the tedium, or the inconvenience. Just get in your car and you'll be able to see what it was like. That's what they hoped. It didn't quite work out that way, though, for quite a while for a number of reasons. Most of them having to do with big, large scale events. There was a Dust Bowl, there was a worldwide depression that hit the United States extremely hard, and there was World War II. All of those things don't really go along well with people getting in their cars and driving around. And indeed, the Grapes of Wrath does not read like a relaxing family road trip to go visit the El Camino Real. It's quite the opposite. And things were kind of, there was a notion of El Camino Real, but it wasn't really something that most people at that point still had experienced much of. Nonetheless, the Auto Club continued to promote that, and it ramped up in the 50s because something else, in addition to the automobile that no one could predict, happened, and that was television. Suddenly people had cars, and suddenly they had a bit of wherewithal, and suddenly there were summer vacations, and you could get in your car and you could experience an adventure in your car in a way that was difficult earlier. And that could be presented on TV. And the notion of a romantic past that you could travel to was also presented on TV. So one of the earliest popular shows was The Mark of Zorro, which came out in 1957 at the same time as that map did, that I just showed you from the Auto Club, starring Guy Williams. And it was this kind of swashbuckling story of that romantic period in California, when it was still Spanish, that Ramona kind of evoked. And it was a Disney product. It was an early Disney product presenting something that Disney wanted people to believe, was something not only that happened or like something that happened, but something they could actually themselves visit. And how could they do that? Well, they could do that in their cars. So Disney became a major promoter of automobiles. And as Walt Disney himself in this advertisement said, he was presenting to the American public a new way of life on wheels. You could see all of these great places. You could travel to romantic destinations like the El Camino Real, and in this case, in your AMC, and you could even, get the endorsement of that by Donald Duck and Goofy and Mickey Mouse. And it was, again, a new way of life, a whole new kind of experience and of course, if you came to California, you would go to Disneyland, obviously. So Disney did have a lot to do with a lot of interest involved in promoting this notion. And the car companies themselves bought into it and took a break from promoting the special, advantages of their products and started presenting, at least for some time, not just their products, but the experience that their products could provide, not just driving around from place to place, or not just, going fast and being stylish, but you could actually have these adventures. So as you see this ad, see the USA in your Chevrolet, if you're of a certain age, you're hearing Dinosaur's voice in your head right now. And if so, well, you're dating yourself. But if you heard it when you were a kid, you're hearing that jingle now. And it provoked people to do exactly that, to travel the USA and have these great adventures across country. Well, if it was cool to see the USA in your Chevrolet, how much cooler would it be to see the El Camino Real in your Chevy El Camino? Because nothing says adventure and romance and heritage quite so much as a 427 cubic inch V8 that can propel you from 0 to 60 in less time than you can say so. I got to tell you, I desperately wanted one of those when I was a teenager. In any case, Chevy named that car specifically because it wanted to evoke this notion of the El Camino Real. Now, at the beginning, when this whole scheme came up, historians poo-pooed the idea. They said there was never any such thing. There were a few footpaths, narrow footpaths, and maybe trails that animals made, but there was nothing, anything remotely like some highway. There was no El Camino Real. And historians all the way through have said it and still say it today. Forget about it. It didn't exist. There was no El Camino Real. So the question is, if there wasn't, and it's illusion, just because the El Camino Real, the way it's been presented here, didn't exist the way it's said, doesn't mean it wasn't there. And it is a crucial question because it has to do with all of these structures and heritage and world heritage and everything else. So I'm going to get back and take a little bigger view for a second about this. And it's, of course, a maritime view. You're not surprised at that because it is the Maritime Historical Society. We're going to talk about why a road may not have been the optimal way to connect all those missions. Very briefly, it's by the numbers. Picking a middle 19th century paradigm to keep them all chronologically apples to apples, some guy can carry about, if you take units of what you can carry, stuff, the size of the pipeline, in other words, as ton miles per day that a man can carry. Okay, and we think about things like this every day in the news when they say how many millions of barrels of oil come out of the Strait of Hormuz, like it was one big pipeline instead of a whole bunch of different tankers and things. But again, let's go with that notion of a pipeline. One guy in good shape could carry about one half of those units. That's not to say a thousand pounds a mile could carry 100 miles, 10 miles, 100 pounds, 10 miles, half one of those units. But you take that guy off the road and you put him in a wagon with mules pulling it, and that one guy can carry 60 of those units, about 120 times what he could just walking along. So it leverages his effort significantly. You still got to pay for the mule and pay to feed the mule, and you got to pay for the wagon, but it's still enough that is way more efficient to do that. But if you take that guy out of his wagon and give him a little bit of training and make him a steam locomotive engineer, it's 600 of those units. In other words, 1,200 times the stuff that this guy can carry driving his locomotive. Again, you got to pay for the ties, and you got to pay for the rails, you got to pay for the locomotive and the cars, and you still got to have water. Earlier you had to feed the water, feed the mules. Now you got to have water because the train uses it. So you're still dependent on water. But still, labor is leveraged significantly. So, all right, no locomotives, no railroads during the El Camino Real, but couldn't it have been a road that wagons went up and down and worked? Well, it might have been, had that been the most efficient way of doing something. But you take that guy off his steam locomotive or off of his wagon or take him off the road, and one guy, and you put him on the Star of India, and he can be responsible, that one guy, for 4,033 of those units. In other words, 8,066 times what that one guy could carry on his own. So obviously, the economies of scale and efficiency and everything else favor movement by sea, not by road, which is what the El Camino Real really was. That was what was hiding underneath that illusion. And so we're going to talk about that, but we're going to go explore a little bit more about how that illusion worked and how we are still captive of illusions like that to a large extent. So if we talk about heritage, and we also have an initiative of the world's great historic ships in play, being made a World Heritage Site by UNESCO. There's about 1,200 of these World Heritage Sites. Most of them are cultural, and we have a bunch in the United States. Here's 3 of them. I'm a little bit out of date in this slide. There's actually about 100 more. It's about 1,300. And if you look at the map, all right, you'll see how they're all clustered in places. And this is not an unusual map. It shows all these things together. And so you imagine that the pathways of cultural diffusion probably proceeded over roads and along land because they're next to each other. These dots are all in connection. So you're looking at what is being presented when we talk about World Heritage as a history of cultural diffusion. And like most maps, the ocean is totally blank. The land has got lots of detail. The ocean, not much detail. There's some lighter spots that I guess are where good snorkeling is supposed to be. But in any case, there's not much. And generally in a map that shows mostly land and it shows a sea route, it's some usually narrow line that is often along a line that sailing ships couldn't go. So I wondered, what would this look like if we made it a little more complete? So I scanned a map I have of the sailing routes of the world from my 1890 Ocean Passages for the World, a British publication. And I'm going to slowly put it into place. You can't see much there, but as it gains in this a little bit more definition, you can see how, to an incredible degree, all of those areas of World Heritage were connected by ocean sailing routes. That what that ends up becoming is the arterial system of World Heritage, if you will. I think I'm a bit biased, but of course I'm talking to the National Maritime Historical Society because I'm not going to get many arguments from you guys. And if we just make it the whole thing, now the map looks different, doesn't it? Okay, it looks like the sea that was blank before is the thing that makes everything work. And that was no less true for the El Camino Real. And the El Camino Real, which we think of as this remote area of the world not connected to the rest of the world, when in fact was incredibly connected by the complex patterns of the Pacific, and was connected through ships and technology Michael Jones may be on, so through blue tech of its day to the rest of the world, as always has been. Now, this is a capture from nullschool.net. I managed by accident to capture a hurricane down there off Baja a couple days ago. That's not all the time, but you can see kind of a pattern of a clockwise pattern that moves around the Pacific. That was really important. It was also took a long time for people to figure out. But the easternmost portion of it, which runs along the California coast, is what we normally think of as the El Camino Real. But what I'm going to ask you to understand is that that really lasted much longer than we're used to thinking, and was much larger and extended in a much more integrated way. Looking at the portion of it, which is California, you see the pattern of winds coming along the coast, eddies coming in south of Point Conception, and again by Cape San Lazaro and Cedros Island, other eddies coming into Baja California, which you're going to figure a little bit later on. But this is the energy flow and the fuel, if it were, that made the El Camino Real work, the Maritime El Camino Real, which was the real one. I want to say one thing. It isn't just about the ocean, because it's neither ocean or land. Okay. It's not either or. Even when you get to the land, you're talking about a different kind of ocean. This is the map of the navigable waterways of the United States in 1850. And such had been the case going back thousands of years. Almost everything in the continental United States was connected by water, and you could get almost everywhere by water. So the image that or the illusion that we presented is that westward migration was entirely a story of mountain men and wagon trains and railroads going across dry, dusty plains. While that's not false, it's actually the case that also the continental United States was a vast inland sea that people moved over by water to get from place to place. And that these pathways were ancient, going back for thousands of years, and they were connected in ways, even, even ways that you wouldn't think. So if you look at the lower left corner of this map, where it's really dry, that's where you think, well, they would have had to go by road there because there's not a lot of water connecting things. Yet in the middle of the 19th century, if you wanted to go, well, today, let's say, if you want to go from San Diego to Yuma, Arizona, you get in your car and you head on Highway 8 East. It's 172 miles away. You'll get to Yuma in 3 hours. Or in your El Camino, supercharged engine, you'll get there in 2 perhaps. But you're going to drive at least a couple hours across a really dry place. In the 19th century, you wouldn't do that. And you wouldn't do it because you might die if you tried. Instead, the shortest way and the most safe way of getting to Yuma from San Diego would have been to take a steamer, a sailing ship from San Diego down to La Paz, up to the Gulf of California, and then to the Colorado River to dock in downtown Yuma. Those of you who have been to Yuma probably think I'm out of my mind. How can anybody dock anything in Yuma? The deepest thing in Yuma now is a water trap on a golf course. Otherwise it's just totally dry. Yet, in this picture, here's a 1,000-ton steamship, the Mojave, tied up in downtown Yuma. Yuma is effectively a maritime suburb of San Diego. And it was connected to the rest of the world by water. And for thousands of years before this, the coastal people using the sea were connected everywhere else and to everyone else by water also through these maritime connections. But our notion that people had to walk places or go by land has been so pervasive for so long that for a long time we couldn't imagine, for instance, any other way that people got into the Americas at all. When archaeological sites in places like Clovis and Folsom were found that were thousands of years old, speculation about, well, those people came from Asia. When did they come? It would have had to be, according to logic, during the periods of the Ice Age, where the ice had locked up so much of the world's water that the Bering Strait became the Bering Isthmus, and people walked across chasing megafauna. The problem with that is that people have been finding inhabited sites older than the 13,000 years when that was open. So what's current now, when people started to envision something they hadn't envisioned before, that thousands of years ago, people did have boats and ships that they could conduct lengthy, impressive voyages, that they moved along through this coastal route, and that the Americas, at least partially, were inhabited to begin with as an overwhelming maritime event, 17,000 to 20,000 years ago. It's called today the Kelp Highway, but I'm just going to keep to theme and call it El Camino Kelpo, okay, if you guys don't mind. Now, it doesn't mean the other thing didn't work going down across the Bering Isthmus when the Ice Age had locked up a lot of water. People came there too, and they did come from Europe, evidently as a maritime event. But the oldest and first in-migration came along as a maritime event and along the coast of California. In other words, the El Camino Real. Now, as evidence of how early that was, there are only 6 major language groups spoken in the Americas, and California is the only place that all 6 are found. It's also worth saying that the maritime resources of those days were considerably denser and richer than they are now with the kelp forests and so forth. So the El Camino Real, arguably 20,000 years or more old, and people have been using it for a long, long time. And as they moved in, of course, they established connective links to each other. But mostly these links went along waterways. If you see this map to the left, those are essentially the ancient byways that indigenous Californians used. Most of them were along water. A lot of them were along the coast. And indeed, some of these pathways go out to sea to the Channel Islands, with the result that the California Channel Islands are among the oldest inhabited places in the Americas. And to do this required fairly sophisticated watercraft and a really sophisticated understanding of the ocean and how to use it, its resources, and how to exploit them. And so, as a result, the peoples along the coast were really, really intelligent and creative in how they used the resources they had to achieve their objectives. They were able to build these fantastic canoes called tomals that both the Tongva and the Chumash did. And remember, I mentioned that eddy that sweeps into the coast of California. It deposits big trees that they could cut out into planks and make these canoes. And the seepage of the oil, along the middle coast there, that can be used to caulk the canoes. When they didn't have those things, they were very creative in using other resources. The Selenians to the north at Chumash used reeds, as did the Kumeyaay to the south of the Chumash, and the Tongva used reed boats. And it got them along the shorelines, out to the islands, using the sea as mariners. And as most mariners are, their vessels are ephemeral. They're made out of organic materials, and they're the closest things people have ever made to human beings, or living things. And as we do, as almost all other people have that use the sea, they try to represent their vessels, which are the repositories of their identity in many cases, in more durable form through petroglyphs, pictographs, and of course, model ships. Now, this is a vessel called the Eel Point canoe from San Clemente Island. It's not that old, ancient, 500 to 1,000 years, but for a while we thought this was the oldest ship model in the Americas. When we exhibited our museum, we irreverently, some of us called it the salsa dish, but there have been other ones found since that are far more ancient. And clearly, the notion of these vessels as having a religious significance and a cultural significance was there by the amount of work and effort they put into these representations. Not only in the representations of their own vessels, which allowed them to use this ancient El Camino Real, but they were also remarkably impressed, effective, and maybe even shocked when suddenly they were confronted with people and ships that they never had imagined existed, like these right here. And it would have been a shocking experience, not unlike, in World of Worlds when the Martians show up. These things that nobody had ever imagined showed up along the California coast. And like most peoples, particularly maritime peoples, an effort to render, like in this picture, the power of the object, which is what Bruegel the Elder did in this picture, that the indigenous peoples also tried to do. So what you're looking at here is a pictograph several hundred years old of European sailing ships. It doesn't come with a caption, so we don't know what expedition this is. It could have been Alarcón or Ulloa or Cabrillo, the Spanish explorer. And Jesus Piñas, if you're here, once again, unequivocally a Spanish explorer, okay, because I told you I would say that, and it's true. But this is a rendering of 3 vessels. This is Dr. Jim Cassidy, who was a archaeologist for Navy Region Southwest, and on the expedition that we went to document this image or this work of art. It's a long way from the sea, and so they were drawing or creating these images from memory to the best that they could. This image here is the middle-sized ship of the 3. It looks like it's walking on legs. But when people are confronted with a ship with oars where they've only been familiar with paddling, often they look this way. And if you are wondering, is this really a ship? And you compare it with this image of the San Salvador, you can see so many elements that are like that, that if you had to take the image to the right from memory and spend days and weeks pecking it into a rock, you could very well end up with something like this. It's actually a fairly good likeness. And this wasn't just a one-off. This happened in other places too. This particular rendering of a ship is called this Corn Springs vessel. We know what this one is because people that saw it were told by the people that made it, this was the first time the indigenous peoples of the Imperial County or from the Colorado had ever seen a steamboat before, much less one that ascended the Colorado River. And it's this particular boat, the Steamboat Explorer in 1857. And if you can see, it's a fair likeness. And not only is it a fair likeness stylistically, it's pretty similar to that picture of the European sailing ship in style, as though, hundreds of years before, it was though they stayed in the same style. But anyway, the point I want to get across is that these were people that used the sea and have done so for thousands of years. And when they saw a new and a different way of using it, the encounter was impressive enough to try and render into a really durable form through a petroglyph or a pictograph. So what were these people doing here? People like Cabrillo. Well, they were trying to get to China. That's what Columbus was trying to do, and it was a problem because it wasn't easy to get to China. 4 Spanish expeditions, beginning with Magellan, end up circumnavigating the world without wanting to because they couldn't get to China, and they had to go around the world until it was figured out by this guy, Andres Urdaneta, who sailed with Legazpi, and he determined this route in this map. He would sail down the trade winds from Mexico to the Philippines, sail up off Japan, and over across to Mexico. And this guy was an Augustinian monk, but he was also a great sea captain, pilot, and navigator. One of the guys in his expedition broke away, Alonso de Arellano, and actually got to Mexico first. But it was really called Urdaneta's route. And this map, commissioned by the second Viceroy of New Spain, is probably the founding document of Pacific oceanography. And if you can look at that image of the Pacific that I showed you earlier, and you can superimpose that map over it, you can see that Urdaneta actually did a pretty good job of finally figuring this out. Why did the Spanish want to do it? Well, they wanted to establish trade from Mexico to the Philippines, which is their entrepot from 1565 on. What did they have to trade? Well, they had what everyone wanted. They had silver. The world ran on silver. The world's economies were limited by the amount of silver in circulation. There were other forms, there were commodities, there were primitive mechanisms of credit, and the Chinese did use paper money to some extent, but all of it was grounded in silver. And when it departed from it, as it did with the Mississippi Company and the South Sea Bubble, usually there was a catastrophic collapse because those things were derivatives, like the derivative of 2008 that caused the Great Recession recently. But silver, that's what it was all about, and the Spanish had most of it. They had most of it because they had discovered that there were literally mountains of silver in Peru and Mexico. This place, Potosi, was a mountain of silver, and through a new process, using mercury to separate silver from its ore, they could mine it efficiently and economically, with the result that a fair proportion of the annual increase in world GDP was dependent on the amount of silver that the Spanish could mine and put into world circulation. Well, that was an enormous benefit to Spain. They had the world's reserve currency. So about 30% of that silver went to the New World through the annual fleets. Went to Europe through the annual fleets. About 30% of it stayed in the New World to fund the economies of there. And the American colonies, the currency of exchange was the Spanish dollar, even though they were converted into pounds sometimes. But 40% of it went across the Pacific to the Philippines. So if you think about this, not quite 40%, but a fair amount of it, of the annual increase in world GDP would sail from Acapulco to Manila on one ship. Never in history has such a great concentration of wealth been placed in so in so tiny a form. They would sail across from Acapulco carrying silver and other things come back with jade, porcelain, lacquerware, finished goods, but mostly silks. And those then were distributed through the New World and then to Europe as well. But that one ship, it ran from about 1571 or 2 to 1815. Now, only 4 of those were ever captured, even though they were very valuable targets. But about 30 of them went missing without a trace. One of them was found off, the San Jose was found off Peru with the entire crew dead of scurvy. One of them disappeared in 1578, not discovered again until off the coast of Baja by beachcombers in the 70s and 80s. And then a number of expeditions were led by Ed von der Porten to Baja California to excavate the cargo of the San Juanillo and the late Ed von der Porten. And so consequently, well, thousands of artifacts were found, and we mounted 2 exhibitions based on the cargo of the ship. And that material culture ended up going into the missions in Baja California, and archaeologists found parts of the cargo of the San Juanillo in missions that were built 150 years later, taken there by the Indians. So because of that, because it was a rough passage back, you could get across to Manila in a few weeks. You would come back in a matter of maybe 5 or 6 months, and ships could be lost. The Spanish needed to know what places the galleons could go into to refresh themselves, cure the crew of scurvy, seek shelter and repairs. And so the first charting of the California coast in a rational way took place in 1602 with Juan Sebastian Biscayno, and we see here some rational depictions of the space. However, the Spanish became concerned about that route and that space by the latter part of the 18th century. Now we've been told for a long time that when Britain got into the Pacific with Captain Cook, and then the Russians with Baranov, and the French with Bougainville, suddenly Spain was insecure about its possessions in California since they were wide open. The question then comes, why should they have cared? They didn't do anything with it for 229 years. The British take it, so what? Well, if the British had managed to establish a base in some place like Monterey or San Diego, they could then stage ships to the line there, and they could have intercepted those galleons on a regular basis, and Spain's long run of the world's currency would have been over. So Spain was anxious to occupy all the places someone else might occupy, because if they didn't do that, they stood to have this route intercepted. Hence, in 1768, Jose de Galvez established a naval base in San Blas, which is on the Mexican mainland, just across from Cabo San Lucas. And these little ships would go out, and it was them really that established the systems of missions and the presidios. One of the early voyages to St. Carlos took 100 days. Half the crew was dead of scurvy. And as you can see, he made 2 clockwise routes, which is what the wind pattern suggested, and relieved the expedition of Portola and Father Serra in San Diego. And they continued to make further voyages up and down the coast. This is the earliest map of the El Camino Real, only it's a maritime map. You can see the head of the Gulf of California in the lower right, and it looks like an isthmus, but in fact, that's because no one knew what the land was to the east of there. In fact, people were still depicting California as an island at this date. But it was a coastwise that was important, with all the harbors and ports, and those are identified in this map. And the route they took was this clockwise route, right? Which we went out to sea, came back in and down. And that essentially was the 2 lanes of the maritime El Camino Real for hundreds of years, and it connected all those places with ships like the San Carlos sailing into the Golden Gate, and ships like the Lydia Bird, Americans, which after the turn of the century began coming west and trading in otters and sealskins. This is a depiction of something called the Battle of San Diego Bay. I actually think it was a sham battle, so that the Spanish didn't have to appear as though they were illicitly trading with the Americans. I don't believe there were any live rounds fired, but nonetheless, it made for a good show and a lot of noise and fireworks. Be that as it may, the Americans were prominent in the El Camino Real from 1800 on. And that brings us back to our circuit. I know I'm running low on time, so I got to speed it up. Back to our circuit to Richard Henry Dana and 2 years before the mast, evoking that same period that the people in Ramona are nostalgic for. Except in this case, it's not a set of missions and presidios connected by by a road, by a grand highway. The grand highway is out at sea. And Richard Henry Dana's depiction of that is just as romantic. It's just as interesting. It depicts California in this way that we can imagine today, in the same way. It's just that we could do it now without an automobile, and we can do it by tall ships. So what I'd like to do is leave you with this thought, I guess. The next time you're driving up Highway 101 or 1 and you see one of those bells, and if you're near the coast and you're looking out and you can look out to sea, and far in the distance, you can see the sunlight off topsails, or you can imagine you can see it. Just think about this way that that El Camino Real, yeah, it was for real, and it still is for real. There you go. Thank you, everybody. And
Thank
that was
you, Ray. Thank you, Ray. And you did you did a fantastic job, and you actually answered a lot of the questions that were sent in ahead of time. In particular, there are a cluster of questions about indigenous roles, and so you did touch on that. Any further thoughts about how this was you know uh, uh, multiple peoples in multiple ways that kind of influenced and built this route.
well, all the descendants of those people that first started using it thousands of years ago, they're still with us, aren't they? They're still part,
Yeah.
they're still part of our community. They're Californians, and we joined them later. And for all the for all the tragedy and the real tragic part took place after the Mexican American War and during the gold rush, for the indigenous peoples. But despite all that tragedy, the indigenous peoples overcame it. And what we can all celebrate is our common ancestry with the sea and our common appreciation for it, our common use of it, and the fact that in one way or another, we're all the descendants of mariners, and we're all connected by that. The same way that the El Camino Real has connected people for thousands of years.
Well said. Well said. There are also a couple of questions and comments from your fellow sailors on the San Salvador.
Okay.
Again, like just wanting to say hello, but then also questions about the sailing properties. Just briefly, could you mention that project, and kind of what the museum did, what you did, and kind of how that is carrying on?
So when I applied for that job 31 years ago, one of the questions in the interview is, we'd like to build this replica of Cabrillo's galleon San Salvador. Don't you think we could do that? Of course, I was interviewing for the job, so I said, "Oh yeah, no problem." And I've since learned not to promise things that I, so readily. So yeah, it was a large project. It was a signature project during the time that I was there. It took several years of research and several years to build it. And it was really an element of community support. About 40 to 50% of the labor that went into San Salvador was volunteer labor. And probably about 20 or 30% of the materials or the value of it was donated. So we never would have been able to build the ship had it not been this overwhelming amount of support. And again, it's a reminder that that ship is representative of a part of this story. And when Cabrillo sailed along the coast and encountered the native peoples, it became part of their story too. And it emphasizes the fact that they were here for thousands of years. And so when we've sailed to California, to San Salvador, up and down the coast, we've always contacted the tribes and said we were coming. We've asked permission to enter their territory, and there's usually been some ceremony that we've enjoyed when we've gone there. Some of them have been quite moving, the Chumash particularly. And it is actually, again, one of these moments when we do this to remind ourselves of how old this story is. It wasn't just the missions. In terms of other aspects, so Kathy, was there some other specific question about, you mentioned things about the sailing
Oh,
machine?
well, there was a question about they just can't get San Salvador to sail to windward. So,
Okay.
uh, do, do, do you theorize that maybe Cabrillo had another way to rig the vessel, or how do you get a vessel like that to sail closer to the wind?
Well, first of all, I haven't been on San Salvador now for a while yet, but I could talk to, I think it was David that asked that question. Um, there's some things we could do, and we have gotten her to sail to windward. She is not going to go to windward with a 12 meter under any circumstances, that's for sure. But you can get her to sail to windward. You have to be patient, and there are certain things that make a little things actually can do that make a big difference. But I think for most of the people listening in, this would kind of get in the weeds. So anybody that wants to just call me up and ask a question, I can just give you my thoughts on it. Um, but I
Well,
appreciate the question. So thank you.
Well, Ray, I mean, you're a masterful storyteller, and I put in the chat over there links to if you like Ray's storytelling presentations, just vast historical knowledge. He told me before this that he doesn't use notes. He just kind of prompts himself with the slides, and he's got all that knowledge, and it's absolutely fantastic to hear him do these things. If you enjoy that and would like to have some really incredible, longer expeditions and opportunities to enjoy that knowledge and these presentations, Ray is partnering with us and with Thalassica Journeys on two different cruises in 2027. So he's going to be the resident expert on board for two cruises. One this coming January to Antarctica, January 6th through 17th, and then another one to Iceland and Eastern Greenland next July. This time next year, you could be off the coast of Greenland, July 27th through August 8th, with Ray as your onboard history expert and just having some really incredible once in a lifetime journeys. And in doing that, you're supporting the National Maritime Historical Society as well as having these fantastic experiences. So please go to our website, seahistory.org, and it's in the chat. And as I mentioned, and the other way you can really support us and the work we do, including the work that Ray is doing on the Ships Committee to further ship preservation, not only in the US, but across the world, is by joining NMHS. Again, that's in the chat, and we greatly appreciate that. Just a couple last comments asking about maps. Oh, and I think they're answering themselves in the chat of different early maps of California. I think, again, very effective and interesting use of the maps. I especially like how you overlaid the shipping routes on those different historic sites. Yeah, let me just scroll through this. Lots of well wishes and hoping you are doing well, and people who really value your work on the San Salvador and hope cruising on that is in your future. And there's a question, last question here about if we're going to repeat this program. This program has been recorded and we will put this up on our website. So please check back. We can send that link out, but all that'll be archived on our website. So if you have somebody else you want to recommend this to, please do. And then one last question here. We have just a couple minutes from your friend Michael Jones. Can you talk for a minute about the vessels as the blue tech of their time?
Yeah, Michael, I knew you were going to come in with that. So thank you. Well, yes, they were. And again, it's hard to imagine any of this happening without technology. Uh, Whether it was the indigenous peoples of California hundreds or thousands of years ago, or it was the Spanish galleons that went up the coast, or it was Richard Henry Dane and the Pilgrim, it doesn't matter. Whenever any culture goes to sea, generally speaking, the ships they go to sea with are the highest and most sophisticated form of technology that they are capable of. So going to sea at all in all its forms is an element for that society of blue tech. And I guess I want to try to show the maps is maybe it would be better as if as when we said technology, it really meant blue tech, and we'd have to say what was the minor part of it by talking about terrestrial tech as a thing that's
Yeah.
maybe less important and less significant in world history.
Yeah. And I love that about maritime history and all these things we're talking about at NMHS. It's all this continuity going through for thousands of years, including up to today, and some of the cutting edge things that we're talking about. Sea history and the kind of things that we focus on. It's not just the past. It's making all of these stories relevant for, again, what is very key for our world today, which is the technology and our oceans and the things that are driving our economy, our security, and our communities, right? So, Ray, I thank you for illuminating a chapter of that. And please, please, please come back and join us again every first Thursday of the month. We're still working on our fall schedule. But again, we'll have this all the way through the end of the year. And if you have ideas of the kinds of presentations or presenters for us, we're always appreciative of those comments. You can always, again, go to our website and contact us through that. So thank you, everyone. Have a lovely evening. And again, Ray, thank you
Thank you,
for all
everybody.
you do.
All right. Have a good evening, guys.
Everybody, have a good night.
Bye bye.